Welcome to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome, everyone, to Et Al, a podcast of Baylor University Press. My name is Joshua Mobley, and I'm very pleased to be hosting today our very own J.P. O'Connor. Now, John Patrick O'Connor is Associate Professor of New Testament at Northwest University and the author of The Last Will Be First, Divine Judgment and the Gospel of Mark, which is on sale now at BaylorPress.com. Welcome, JP. So glad to have you.
Josh, I'm so excited to be here and so honored to talk about this book.
Yeah, well, thank you. We're really honored to have published it. It's a great piece of work. And it's a book about, as the title will indicate, it's about judgment and divine judgment, specifically in the Gospel of Mark. And I would probably not be wrong to state that the theme of judgment is one that tends to make people uncomfortable. Right. We are, as a rule, we are not supposed to be judgmental of other people. And so you went and you just grabbed the nettle and just wrote a whole book on judgment. So talk about that. Why? Why did you want to start there?
Well, if you want to see people cringe when you talk to them at a coffee shop, you tell them you're writing a book on divine judgment and hell. And they immediately start moving away from you in proximity, right?
That's right.
No, I'm really interested in this topic of divine judgment. And part of it comes from my own denominational background. I'm a member of the Assemblies of God. I teach at Northwest University, which is an Assemblies of God institution. And whereas a majority of Christian denominations these days aren't really preaching on divine judgment and especially hell, conversations in the last 6 to 8 years in my circles have actually revolved around judgment. And so some of the language I was hearing either around my student population or some of the circles I partake in, I wanted to establish a better, what I'm calling in this book, grammar of judgment. So if a majority of Christian communities aren't talking about judgment, but those that are talking about judgment are doing so in a way that's malformative or perhaps just promoting theology that's more harmful than helpful. A secondary concern of this book is how can we encourage communities of faith to talk about judgment in a way that is healthy, biblical, and theologically coherent. But I would say a majority of people hear the word judgment and they want to get as far away from me as humanly possible. So,
well, fair enough. Yeah. So, you're concerned with how to talk about judgment in a healthy way. And I love very early on in the book, you crystallize that with two questions that I think are really serious and profound. So if God is indeed a God of judgment, this is you writing, then whom does God judge? And for whom does God judge? So how does your book take on those two questions? So whom does God judge and for whom does God judge? How does your book kind of revolve around those two questions?
Yeah, so one of my favorite classes I have been able to teach the last few years is an introduction to Koine Greek. And any student of Greek will learn there are basic semantics of a sentence. You have the subject, you have the verb, and you have the direct object. And this is kind of the fundamental grammar of a Greek sentence in ways that are painful at times.
Right.
So in the way I've established this question that you read, Josh, is who is the subject of divine judgment in the Hebrew Bible, in Second Temple Judaism, and ultimately as expressed in the Gospel of Mark? And who is the direct object, or we might even think of the indirect object if we think of God as the judge, and whom is God judging, and the indirect object being for what reason or purpose. And that's the basic grammar I'm trying to establish in this book. And I mean, just to give away part of the thesis is God is most often the judge in the Bible, and in particular in the Gospel of Mark. And I'm claiming that God is judging in defense of some of the most vulnerable characters in Mark's gospel to be interpreted as judgment in defense of some of the most vulnerable and marginalized populations in our world today. And there are a myriad of ways we can read the judgment of God in the Bible, and some of them are more cringe than others. So,
Right.
so my book tries to establish a thread and a sort of consistent theme in places like Genesis and the book of Daniel and the Apostle Paul and eventually in Mark that has this really profound and persistent feature of judgment, that God is issuing judgment, or a representative in behalf of God is issuing judgment in defense of those who can't necessarily speak for themselves. And in writing this book, I was just continually provoked and honestly intrigued by the ways in which God is portrayed as judging those who might take advantage of vulnerable populations, or those that might accumulate wealth without thinking about the consequences of that. And to me, it seems to be a present theme in Mark's gospel, especially.
Yeah, so I appreciate the way you describe this as a grammar, because, you know, it's on the title of the book that we're focusing on the Gospel of Mark, but this isn't something that you want to remain limited to your close reading of Mark. So you do an excellent close reading of Mark in a few key passages, but the book is, in spite of that title, actually quite broad in terms of the range of texts that you address in attempting to build what you call a grammar, a hermeneutic, a way of understanding kind of divine judgment. And so I do really appreciate that kind of breadth. And maybe we'll come back to that at the end and kind of let you unpack the forward-looking, constructive element of what you do here. But let's drill down on this question of Mark here for a second, because why Mark? I mean, you know, you think about judgment and you think about certain passages in Matthew or Luke or certainly Revelation or something like that, but why the Gospel of Mark?
Yeah, so in writing my dissertation advisor was Clifton Black, and a member of my committee was Dale Allison. So you have a Mark scholar and a Matthew scholar, and anything I wrote on Mark, Dale would ask this same question. He would say, you know, with his, endearing, quizzical face, you know, why is this any different than Matthew? And if you went to a library and you looked for a book on judgment in Mark's gospel, you would be hard-pressed to find one. So in a really introductory way, this book is attempting to be a definitive book on judgment in Mark's gospel. So that's partly why it's so exhaustive, is there isn't really in a library on a call shelf a book on divine judgment in Mark. But there are so many interesting ways, I would argue, that Mark sets himself apart from Matthew, let's say. And one of my favorite examples is Mark's judgment text in Mark 9:42 through 50. It is the text in which Jesus is telling people to chop off arms and limbs to avoid the fires of Gehenna. And Mark and scholars have been completely puzzled by this passage. And I think it was Eugene Boring in his commentary says that this is the only section of Mark that defies interpretation. And the form critics famously thought that this section of Mark was just a series of sayings of Jesus that were put together because of catchwords. Like you have fire and you have children mentioned and you have like sort of these similar themes. And so the larger section of Mark 9, like 33 and following, is sort of a random set of Jesus sayings that aren't necessarily coherent. This book says no. That's actually not the case. Matthew takes this section of Mark and divides it into two places. So you have the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus talks about, poking out eyes and cutting off hands in sort of his section on sexual purity and marital fidelity. And then in Matthew 18, you have, Matthew's famous ecclesiology about how we might cut out members of the body who sort of aren't healthy for the body. Mark, I don't think, is doing either of those things. In Mark, you have this section of communal leadership. You know, the disciples are in a room with Jesus, and they're asking about, you know, who is going to be with Jesus, who is greatest in the kingdom. And he invites a little child to join him. And also right before this passage, you have the anonymous exorcist pericope, which is this short saying in Mark where the disciples are disgruntled that some rando is driving out demons who isn't on their team.
Right.
And Jesus is like, don't worry about it. As long as they're driving out demons, it'll all sort itself out in the end. So I would argue that this passage of Mark makes the most sense through the lens of divine judgment. That what we have here is an interest in protecting vulnerable populations. What I call in the last chapter of this book, the mikra, the little things or the little ones in Mark. And here we have children. Like, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, then grave consequences await. It is no coincidence in the literary and narrative format that this is coming on the heels of Jesus's commission to the disciples on good leadership. What does a leader in this community look like? Well, I'm going to tell you, rather than give you a leadership seminar, I'm going to tell you that I'm actually most concerned with how people treat little children. And that to me is a way in which Mark stands out in comparison to Matthew especially. Mark just has a different agenda when it comes to thinking about the grisliest sayings of Jesus, one of which is protecting vulnerable groups.
And so you mentioned children. Your book outlines several other groups that Mark is kind of rallying around. What are some of those people that you think Mark is describing God as enacting judgment on behalf of?
Yeah, absolutely. One great text to look at is Mark chapter 6 and the banquet before Herod. Mark clearly identifies that the people at this banquet are Herod and Galilee's finest. You know, you sort of have the bigwig. And the text does not mention traditional, like, semantic terms for judgment. You know, you don't have an explicit reference to judgment. But part of what I argue in this book is, as the reader, you should read Herod's treatment of this little girl, this young, vulnerable girl, as particularly deserving of divine judgment. I mean, partly what he does in this exchange with the corroboration of Herodias is a little girl is meant to carry on a platter the, you know, head of John the Baptist, right? And so we're meant to think of this story as a condemnation. What kind of person, right, would allow a little girl to participate in this way? And you can piece together similar episodes in which Mark's Jesus is an advocate for daughters. And you think about Mark 5:21 through 43. It's the famous Markan intercalation or Markan sandwich where Jairus' daughter is about to die. And Jesus is interrupted by the hemorrhaging woman, who he also refers to as daughter. And then just a few chapters later, you have the Syrophoenician woman in Mark chapter 7, and she is advocating in behalf of her daughter. And so you sort of have this theme in which, you know, Mark's Jesus is interested in these marginal characters, and these more marginal characters for the purpose of bringing them into the family of God, for calling them daughter. And that's, I think, one prominent way in which a well-documented theme in Mark, the reversal of insiders and outsiders, is actually playing on categories of judgment. And I want readers of this book to think, well, who is included in God's family? Like, when I think about how judgment is used today, Josh, judgment is often used to ostracize, to alienate, to condemn. What if we flip it on its head and we say, actually, a coherent theological and biblical account of judgment is to include, to look favorably upon, to defend those whom we might otherwise count as outside or as, beyond the category of God's family. I think Mark challenges those sometimes rigid categories for us in a way that I think is quite provocative.
Yeah, so I think of those stories that you mentioned, the most provocative one, to my mind, is the Syrophoenician woman, and the interaction between Christ and this woman is sort of famously difficult to understand and kind of work through exegetically. So, but I love the way you handled it in the book, and I wonder if you could outline for us, like, how does that particular story, maybe recap the story briefly if there are any listeners who aren't completely familiar, and then give us a sense of how, in that way, God is enacting judgment on behalf of this woman, and in such a way that exposes our own insider-outsider distinctions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Josh alluded to the difficulty of this text. I've preached this text before. It's a difficult text to preach. So Mark 7 is this larger discourse of Jesus on things that are clean or unclean. Like, the chapter begins with this larger discourse of, what goes into a person, making them unclean, or what comes out of a person, making them clean or unclean. And it transitions, I think, very purposely, to a Syrophoenician woman who enters into a room, presumably a private room, we're not really told necessarily, and advocates for her daughter who is possessed by an unclean spirit. And Jesus offers this frustrating response to her,
Right.
He talks about the crumbs of the table, only meant for the little dogs, which is a saying of Jesus that we wrestle with. And the woman persists, and she advocates for her daughter, and Jesus acknowledges her faith, her advocacy, and her little daughter is exorcised of this unclean spirit. And I love this episode because it tells us so much about the theology of Mark. And Jesus is someone in Mark from start to finish who is operating in behalf of God, right? From the beginning of the gospel to the end, we're invited to ponder who this Jesus is as the Son of God, which Mark 1 tells us, and the centurion tells us at 15:38, right near the end. So the readers, they're pondering, well, what does it mean that Jesus is the Son of God? And Jesus is someone as God's Son who's operating in behalf of God. And in this episode, there is an unlikely character, right? By all means, an outsider who is able to sort of speak a word to even Jesus that provokes this favorable response for her vulnerable little girl. And one thing that sets Mark apart, I think, from Matthew and Luke, and especially John, is Jesus is an exorcist, right? So Jesus in Mark's gospel is known as this, person who casts out the demonic, casts out unclean spirits. And this is yet another, I think, image of divine judgment and eventually justice, which is the demonic, something that is persistently misanthropic in Mark's gospel, is harming the body of a little girl. And even in the body of a Syrophoenician little girl, someone who might be peripheral in many ways, even this person is able to experience, freedom in her physical body, by way of God's judgment against the demonic and justice for her and her family.
Yeah. And I wonder if part of what's going on there, as you've kind of already alluded to, is that the judgment is being enacted. And I think it's very easy today to only think of judgment maybe in terms of kind of, judge and jury for human beings. But your book is drawing out the fact that for Mark, judgment is a much more expansive category, encompassing a far more kind of cosmic dimension. And so hence Jesus is an exorcist. And so he's consistently performing judgment upon these demonic entities, which is maybe, again, something that in our own culture we would not be looking for in the text necessarily, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I wonder if you could say a few more things about that. Like, how is this judgment cosmic in scope?
Yeah, I mean, I love the anonymous exorcist little episode in Mark 9 I talked about a moment ago, because I think it details exactly what we're talking about here, that, exorcism becomes a way in which divine judgment is exercised, double entendre there, for Mark. And this anonymous exorcist presumably doesn't belong to this Jesus group, right? Who is this guy who figured out how to cast out demons, right?
Yeah.
But
right.
But it's in Mark, it's more about alignment with God's will and way. And you see that famously in Mark 3:30-35, when Jesus asks, who is my mother and brother? And, he's presumably casting shade on his own mother here. And he outlines whoever does the will of God, right, is a part of this family. And in Mark, the will of God is a stance against the demonic. And Mark consistently portrays this force, this cosmic force, as anything seeking to harm humans, right? So in Mark 5, the Gerasene demoniac is harming himself. This is one feature of the demonic here. With the story of the epileptic boy in Mark chapter 9, famously, the demonic's trying to kill him, is how it's presented. Like he's throwing him into fire and water, hoping that he might drown. And so we have this consistent portrait of the things that are not of God as against the will and way of God. And if we further detail what those things are, Josh, they're forces that seek to harm, mistreat of God's creation. And I think the question we ought to ask ourselves is, are there things I'm participating in? Are there systems that I implicitly or explicitly participate in that may in fact harm members of God's family, or may in fact harm God's creation? And I don't think that's an easy question to answer. And, Jesus asked the same question of the rich man in Mark 10. He asks him to give up his wealth. And Michael Peppard has this great article on Mark 10 in which he talks about this command that only Mark sneaks in. It's not in Matthew or Luke, which is not to defraud. It's only found in Mark's gospel. Peppard makes this brilliant case that perhaps this rich man was guilty of defrauding his neighbors. What if this rich man's wealth was actually accumulated through dishonest means? What if he's just receiving a paycheck and he's less familiar what BlackRock Industries is up to?
Sure.
They're just buying a bunch of homes,
Right.
Sometimes minor details. Sometimes I think as consumers, we're sort of like, we're trained to not really think twice about where the products are coming from that we're consuming. And divine judgment in Mark provokes us to wonder, well, am I actually complicit in a system that might, in the end, be a direct object of God's divine judgment? And I think the answer to that question, according to Mark, is, are the things I participate in, are they complicit in harming, creatures of God, especially vulnerable populations?
Absolutely. And I mean, you could take that in a million different directions in considering our own lives reflectively, whether that's environment or economics or politics, really in any of those spheres. I think you could push that question, and probably all of us would discover significant ways in which we are contributing to the harm of other people. But I want to linger for a minute on the question of wealth, because your book does a really interesting job of building this kind of cumulative case from the reception history of prior divine judgment acts, particularly in the Hebrew Bible. So thinking about the interpretation of the Sodom and Gomorrah event in particular, and the way that very quickly that's taken as a kind of a judgment of God upon their hoarding of wealth, right? Yeah. Or which is a very surprising interpretation, I think, today. But even as you bring up, even John Calvin is interpreting it that way. And so, which is maybe more recent than one might think. So it's a really interesting take that that the kind of the question of economics and wealth is perhaps more local to the text than is obvious to us. And I wonder if you could kind of unpack some of that, sort of the reception history of some of these prior acts of divine judgment as depicted in the Hebrew Bible, and how that gets picked up and forms the context in which Mark is making these kinds of statements.
It's a great question, and it it provokes very important questions about hermeneutics. How a text is interpreted and applied. And one theme in my book is establishing that even within the biblical canon, stories are being interpreted and reinterpreted for slightly different ends, for slightly different communities. I mean, if we think about the Gospels, Matthew is an interpreter of Mark, and Mark is an interpreter of the sayings of Jesus, and so the story of Sodom and Gomorrah becomes, my heuristic case in the book, which is presumably a story about judgment, right?
Right.
And the ways in which it's read, even within the own biblical canon, is surprising. Ezekiel and Jeremiah, the prophetic corpus, have ways to interpret the Sodom and Gomorrah episode that may in fact surprise us. Focusing on issues of wealth accumulation, gluttony, or pride. Philo, Augustine, you mentioned John Calvin. So one important lesson I hope readers will learn from this book is when we think about the grammar of judgment, when we think about it in the context of the Bible, we have to ask today, who is interpreting this text, and for whom is this text being interpreted? And in this way, I think that those who might otherwise dismiss passages of divine judgment as, oh, that's not for me. Well, hold on, Buster. If you think about the ways in which this text has been interpreted, you're actually the target audience. You might actually be. And so, Sodom and Gomorrah, when it's interpreted by Philo as a test case in greed, all of a sudden more of us are implicated in the wrath of God against this, this particular group in Genesis 18 and 19.
Yeah.
So, that's a consistent theme in the book. If you look at it through the lens of the Second Temple period, you actually see this consistent theme of judgment against leaders within the community who have misappropriated their roles to the detriment of the people that God appointed them to shepherd. So in the Enochic corpus, we see this. You see this in the animal apocalypse. You see a judgment of 70 shepherds who were appointed by God to care for the flock, and yet they've abandoned their roles. They've gained interests elsewhere to the detriment, to the point of jeopardizing God's sheep. You see this in the Psalms of Solomon, a text that clearly outlines that those who have sided with Rome, who have chosen to accumulate wealth over caring for God's people and God's temple, they are in fact condemned. And so what's interesting is if we narrow it down even further, there seems to be this theme of judgment upon those who are within sort of the traditional family, the traditional ecclesial body, who have chosen, instead of caring for the least and the last, to accumulate resources, to hoard. And I argue that if we follow the thread from the Hebrew Bible to places like the Enochic corpus, to the Psalms of Solomon, this is expressed clearly, as a crescendo eventually to the Gospel of Mark, in which we have potentially this group of scribes who Jesus clearly condemns in chapter 12 of Mark. They are apparently, the scriptures say, devouring widows' houses. They are choosing for themselves the finest seats in the synagogue. And this is contrasted to the widow who gives, the very last penny she has. Yeah. And so I'm trying to connect those themes. Yeah. So I hope that answers the question.
Great. Yeah, it does. It certainly does. It does provoke another question, though, because, of course, you're offering this grammar of judgment, but there's also an enormous risk in highlighting divine judgment as a theme in the Bible that we interpreters ought to somehow take on, because who's doing the judging is frequently enough those people who are in power, right? Or especially if you think, the person who's responsible within the community for interpreting this text is going to be the one with the privilege and the education and the resources, to have access to it and have access to all of that, which means that oftentimes the judgment can be reflective of the priorities of the most powerful person in the room. And so how do we avoid that? And I guess a follow-up to that question is avoiding that really native to the text? Or are you perhaps, as an expositor, open to the charge here of cherry-picking the parts of judgment that you like and maybe leaving out the bits that maybe feel a bit more arbitrary or something like that?
Well, it's so fun to write on hell, Josh, because the answer to your second question is the entire history from canon onward of interpreting hell is cherry picking the text. Within the canon itself, if we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, Jeremiah and Ezekiel are cherry picking that story.
Right. Fair enough.
Right. So I would argue that the canon provokes us to take passages of scripture and interpret them in ways that are very conscientious of the reader and the reading community.
Yeah.
But specifically to think about your question, I mean, I'm writing this book teaching at North Central University, which is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. My classroom is located on Chicago Avenue, where George Floyd was murdered. And I'm teaching classes on New Testament theology during the Derek Chauvin trial. It's actually happening a few blocks away from my classroom.
Wow.
And so, this writing wasn't abstract for me. It was happening while students are asking me questions about who's guilty, should this person be charged, what actually happened. And when we're having these, fruitful, at times tense conversations about the murder of George Floyd. And my direct response to your question, I try to answer at the last chapter of the book, which is I picked the pocket of Ignacio Ellacuría, who was a liberation theologian, a priest in El Salvador, who talks about writing for concrete communities of faith. I think what's important is that we don't talk about the abstract, but we talk about the concrete. And Nancy Pineda Madrid is another resource I draw upon, and she's looking at violence against women in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And she's looking at specific stories of people who are being harmed by entities and political structures of power, rather than abstracting suffering and making it sort of like an existential question. She invites us to look at actual bodies. And so I think this book, what I hope readers would get from this book is the question, who are the concrete communities of, within my own neighborhood that are sometimes harmed by questions surrounding judgment, legislation, sharing of resources, and look within your own concrete moment in history and ask, who is God judging in, I live in Kirkland, Washington. For whom is the judgment of God in the square footage that I currently live in? When I pastored for a little while in Lakewood, Washington, which is a little bit south of Tacoma, Washington, where I grew up. And I often think about the work of that church to advocate for some low-income communities that surrounded our church. And there was often in that area, there was a sharp socioeconomic divide between folks who were quite wealthy and folks who had very little. And the community was called Woodbrook. It was a little subsection of Lakewood. And I often think about the people and the stories they're etched in my mind from that particular community and thinking about, well, what does the justice of God mean for them? And so that would be kind of my encouragement to, because there's this trend in biblical studies when it comes to judgment that is so entrenched. You can read Rudolf Bultmann's Theology of the New Testament. People don't like a judgy God. You know,
Yeah.
Rudolf Bultmann did not like a Jesus who issued judgment in certain ways. He tried to distance Jesus from those things. And so people don't like a God who seems, you know, according to their description, capricious and, you know, judging folks and smiting folks. And I want us to think about, okay, we agree. We don't want a capricious, angry God who's constantly unsettled by, you know, minor things. But what does it mean if God actually does issue judgment? And what if it's quite severe? And what if that judgment is issued against particular people who take advantage of vulnerable populations? Well, I think that's a grammar of judgment maybe more of us can get behind. And it's a bit healthier instead of sending my neighbors to hell because they don't mow their lawn. It's actually quite specific.
Yeah.
You know, actually, there's specific ways to apply this within our own neighborhoods, I think.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think, you know, one way of understanding kind of what you are doing in this book is trying to uncover the ways in which Mark is trying to shock us into that realization. You know, you know, the Syrophoenician woman story being an excellent example of, you know, all of a sudden this person that we all just assume at the beginning, this is an outsider. And even the way the story unfolds, you're like, yeah, even Jesus thinks this woman is an outsider. And then all of a sudden the whole thing flips at the end. And I think one way of understanding your approach to Mark here is trying to expose the ways that Mark is trying to provoke us into looking around and be like, okay, wait a second. Maybe as the reader of this text, I'm actually the one who's being judged, you know, and provide the resources then to respond.
I totally agree. I think the best illustration of this is at the end of Mark 14, when you sort of have this famous example of Peter denying Christ. He does so 3 times. So it's actually a judicial text, right? He's actually being asked specific questions. So we sort of envision a courtroom. But I think it's so important to ask, well, who is judging Peter in behalf of God? And in this particular case, it's an enslaved girl. So someone who might otherwise have little to no power in you know, ancient Roman society. And then we ask ourselves, well, whom is God judging? And Josh, the answer is Peter, right? Right. Someone who's presumably an outsider, someone who in Mark 9 gets to participate in the transfiguration scene. I mean, this guy is not just a disciple, he's top 3, you know?
Right.
And yet, near the end of the story, it's an enslaved girl who stands and says, aren't you one of them? She's actually the one who gets to issue judgment, I would argue, in behalf of God against this insider of insiders. And I think that episode illustrates exactly what you just said, that the Gospel of Mark and hopefully the exposition of this book invites us to ask, well, am I on the receiving end of divine judgment? Are there ways in which I have grown comfortable and complicit with systems and structures that aren't really on the side of God? I'm not the anonymous exorcist here. I might be someone who's actually participating in putting unclean spirits into people. You know, it might be, it might in fact be the opposite. So yeah, these questions make us uneasy, don't they? You know?
Yeah, well, they should, right? They absolutely should. And I suppose, thank you for expositing the text in such a way to make us feel that unease. I think that's probably very close to the heart of what Mark is trying to do for us as an author. And thank you for this book. So for everyone watching or listening, this is the book that is out now at BaylorPress.com. Look it up today. This is J.P. O'Connor's The Last Will Be First, Divine Judgment in the Gospel of Mark. JP, thank you for a really engaging conversation today. I really appreciate your time, and thank you for writing this wonderful book.
Thanks, Josh. Hopefully this is the longest conversation on divine judgment you'll have this week.
Well, I don't know. I feel like I may need to go pray and repent a whole bunch. So maybe God and I can have a slightly longer conversation about it later.
Well, thanks. Cheers. It's been a blast.
Awesome. Thank you, JP. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.